When you buy these refrigerant tanks, they're sold in net weight, how much product is inside of it. And even though all these tanks look the same, different refrigerant has different weights. They have different quantities in it. So the specific gravities of refrigerants are different. So in the same exact cylinder, you can overall get less refrigerant Fortinet in a tank as you can get R22 in a tank. So if you were to go buy R22 refrigerant, it comes in a net 30 pounds of refrigerant. When you buy R410A, it comes in a net 25 pounds of refrigerant. Overall, we can get less refrigerant in that same tank. Another thing is when I get a new tank of refrigerant, the first thing I like to do is put that on a scale. And I write down what the gross is, gross being total, the net plus the weight of the tank and box itself. Now I know what the total weight of this is and I have a better idea as I keep track and I'm using refrigerant of how much is less. If I know the total weight, I can subtract my beginning weight and I know how much is left inside of that tank. Now, why that's important is because every manufacturer uses different suppliers for their tanks. There is no set weight of what a tank should be. Also, Fortinet refrigerant tanks, since Fortinet has a higher pressure, the tanks are built thicker, so it's thicker metal. So this tank itself empty will weigh more than this tank weighs empty. So this tank has thinner metal. Even though it's the same physical size, this tank having a thinner metal on it, it weighs less. And every single manufacturer can have a different weight on that. Now, another thing I want to point out to you, it's very important. Now, also inside of these tanks, we can use vapor or liquid. Well, R22 is a single compound refrigerant. So I can take it out as vapor form or I can take it out as liquid form. But R400 series or any kind of a blend of refrigerant means there's liquid and vapor together. In liquid form, it's the equal amount of all the different refrigerants together, like it's supposed to be. And so we want to take it out as liquid. So here in this tank, if I had liquid here, my valve is at the top. So if I was to open this valve, vapor is going to come out. And I would get different amounts of vapor. Different refrigerants would be coming out at a different rate. And this would cause fractionation. It changes the mixture, how much of one refrigerant versus another. So if you're working with a 400 series refrigerant or any blend of refrigerant, you want to turn the tank to where it's upside down. Now liquid refrigerant is going to be at the bottom where the valve is, and as we're taking refrigerant out of the tank, it's coming out as a liquid form and the precise amount. Now as we're doing this, we must throttle it in, little bitty bursts to allow that liquid refrigerant to boil to a vapor before it gets into that compressor. Now most of the tanks will have little instructions on it. It says this end up for liquid and this end up for vapor, so it's telling you which side. Now, R410A refrigerant is so close, if you were to take it out as vapor, it probably wouldn't hurt anything. It's just the numbers are so close together, but we still want to take it out as liquid. R22, it's a pure refrigerant. I can take it as liquid or vapor. I typically still charge it as liquid because it's just so much faster. Little bitty bursts, little bitty shots of refrigerant. Now about the color of the tanks, forever these tanks were green, a light colored green was R22 and rose colored tanks were Fortinet. But now that's changing. Since there's so many types of refrigerant now and new refrigerant still coming out, there's not enough colors left. So now the new tanks are making them all gray. So you come up to somebody and you're getting used to seeing these rose colored tanks, it may not be. You'll now start to see the R22 and Fortinet and whatever other refrigerant are all going to be the same gray color because there's just so many. How do you tell? You're going to have to read on the bottle. It'll have a stamp on there. Somewhere on there, it'll have a numbers like this one's R410A or HFC 410A. This one's R22 or HCFC 22. When you buy refrigerant, it's going to come in a tank that's typically inside of a box. And we buy this refrigerant, it's a one-time use only tank. In other words, we use the contents of this tank up, we put it in the refrigeration systems, and what's left over, the vapor that's left over, still has to be recovered out. This is below 0 psi gauge, and then we have to bust or break the tank to render it useless. This is a one-time only tank. Federal law forbids the transportation if refilled, a penalty of $500,000 fine and 5 years in federal penitentiary. That's serious. Like that's massive. They are not kidding about that. On top of that, they put a check valve inside of here, so you can't even put refrigerant back in. Refrigerant can come out, but you can't get it back in because of the check valve. If we also read further on the instructions, it says disposal. Recover the residual contents of this cylinder into a DOT approved cylinder prior to disposal of an empty container. When emptied, 0 psi gauge or less. Leave open and dispose of the container properly. DOT 39. Some other ones specifically said do not use as an air tank. These refrigerant tanks, we cut it open, there's just raw metal inside of it, and it's thin metal on top of that. It's made for one-time use only. So there's just refrigerant here. In other words, they pull a deep vacuum and then they put pure refrigerant in it. No oxygen and no moisture in there, so it can't oxidize, it cannot rust. Now, once I cut this open, you can see inside of here it's starting to rust because of the air, the oxygen in the air and the moisture in the air is causing this to rust. Now, if you imagine you're trying to reuse this for an air tank and you're putting in here oxygen and moisture in here, this tank would rust and rupture and be a safety hazard. So they are very strict on not reusing these tanks. So here you can see this is a Fortinet tank. It's similar, except Fortinet is a higher pressure, so the tank is made a little bit thicker, a little thicker tank inside of here. But what's cool about it is once we cut this open, we can actually take that check valve out and take a look at it. And this is the check valve, and it's nothing more than just simply a little ball inside of here. So refrigerant can come this direction out of the tank, and the ball moves out of the way, the refrigerant goes around. But if you try to put anything back into the tank, the ball gets seated back down to the bottom and it stops the flow. So it allows it to be one way only on that refrigerant. So these tanks have been recovered and there's a giant hole, so they're rendered useless. Now they also have this little snap disc in here. You can break this off with a screwdriver. It's the weakest part of the whole entire tank. So typically what we'll do is we'll put a screwdriver right on the edge of that and we snap that. We break that piece open and that renders this tank useless. So we can't use it anymore. After we have rendered this tank completely useless, in other words, we've recovered refrigerant and we've rendered it useless, then we can send this off to be recycled or throw it away. Now, a lot of people, what they like to do is make things out of them. One thing I used to do is I used to take these tanks and make jack-o'-lanterns out of them. I'd cut the different eyes in it and a mouth in it and a hole in the back for a candle, and people loved it. I'd paint them up and then people would buy them around Halloween, and they wouldn't have to worry about the jack-o'-lantern stinking or falling apart or the candle being a fire issue. It was contained. I used to also take and cut these apart and make flower pots. We had 2 different flower pots. I'd put paint on the inside, put some drain holes in there. People would be able to hang them. Sometimes I'd even take and cut holes in the center to put plants in and they would hang down. I can't grow plants, but I was able to sell these for people who did, and was able to take something that was being thrown away and be able to make some money with it. Either way, you have to recover that last little bit of refrigerant out of these tanks. Then the next thing I want to point out is how they come shipped. When you buy this, it comes in a cardboard box. A lot of people will take them immediately out of the cardboard box and put it into a metal rack that holds refrigerant. I personally like to leave it inside of the cardboard boxes for a few reasons. And one of those reasons is the price of refrigerant is through the roof. This tank of R22 is well over $1,000 now, and that's a lot of money. And this is very thin metal. I've seen before where technicians set this down and these little feet on the bottom get damaged very easily, very quickly. Just a little bitty pebble on the ground sticking it on there has caused these to rupture before you lose the whole entire tank. So any little bit of extra protection you have between the tank and what you're working with helps this tank last longer. It helps keep it protected. The other thing is, if they're in the back of the truck, imagine hitting the brakes and this falling over and it's just going to roll around. Where if I have it in the cardboard box, it's more likely to stay where it's not going to roll around. Now, in the old days, I used to have a van with these refrigerant racks, and we'd put the tanks in the refrigerant rack, and it had a thing that held it, and it kept it, for the most part, at an angle where it was partially upright. But those tanks still took up a lot of room. And what we find now is we have more refrigerant we have to carry than ever before, especially since there's more and more replacement refrigerants. So I like to just take that rack completely out, and I've made a rack that holds these square bottles. So now I can stack these very easily, and because they're in the box, they stack, and I have that little extra level of protection. So some people, though, they're completely against that. The first thing to do is rip it off, take it out. I like to leave it into the box for as long as possible, and eventually the box is going to dilapidate and you end up with a tank like this. It doesn't have the box, and that's okay, but for as long as possible, I like to keep it in the box, my personal preference. Now, some of these tanks specifically say, this tank particularly says, do not remove inside cylinder from the carton for transportation. They're specifically saying it has to be inside of its carton. The cylinder by itself is not authorized for transportation without the original carton. Do not refill with any substance. Danger, not suitable for compressed air, and do not incinerate. So they're very specific on these tanks and these cylinders. So that's just some little things that will help you and protect you as you get through this new trade.